Why don't we get started? I know people are still rolling in. I had warned Alan that our classes are a little bit like college in terms of people sort of rolling in a little late, only maybe worse, but oh well. We're here, which is all a wonderful thing. So it's my pleasure to introduce again for our second week Alan Bernstein. He's Professor Emeritus of Medieval History at the University of Arizona, and he received his PhD in Medieval History. I'll turn this way so Alan can see me a little bit. From Columbia, and notably, as I mentioned last week, for me, he taught at Stanford when I was there and was my professor in my medieval history class, which, as I said, was hands down my favorite class there. We're particularly lucky because he's a real expert on the subject of hell, and is the author of two books on the history of hell, and its development in patristic Christianity, rabbinic Judaism, and early Islam. One of them, which I have a copy of, is the Formation of Hell, which was published in 1993 and was nominated for Pulitzer Prize and also National Book Award. And as I mentioned last week, David Groff, who's sitting back there, is currently reading it. I don't know if you're done yet. Wait, okay, he finished. So anyway, and then also, anyway, here's a copy, and it is available at the Multnomah County Library for checkout. Oh, and then one final note, as I also mentioned last week, which I think is related to our subject, that Alan has a website devoted to altruism, which is you can look it up on the internet, but it's www.tempoandhup.com. So with that, though, I'll turn things over to Alan. We're really looking forward to week two.
Thank you, John, and thank you all. I appreciate your returning, and I look forward to moving on through the topics that we've associated. So why don't we get right to work, because this is a subject I first started examining in 1978. I spent a summer reading The City of God and then the selected passages on hell from Thomas Aquinas, and branched out from there into all kinds of things. It was absolutely fascinating, a very, very rewarding excursion into research, religion, rationality, mysticism, and I discovered all kinds of things that I did not expect when I started the project. So now we're boiling down 40 years of work into less than an hour. And so I've broken it up into the subjects you see on the board right now. And one of the first points I want to make is that there are many concepts of death, and only one of them involves a judgment by a divinity with the possibility of eternal consequences. So we'll look at those options and try to understand that the difference between heaven and hell is a decision that humans have made. Then we'll look at some illustrations that show how this is represented visually. And we'll look at opposition that grew up to the decisions that were made and frequently imposed from above by political forces. And then we'll look at some of the imaginary, although I suppose one could debate this, visions of hell where a person has a near-death experience and sees the other world, returns to tell about it. and sometimes this is totally fictional and understood to be fictional, like Dante's Inferno, and sometimes the narrator contends that this did indeed happen to him or her. So let's begin. So at the options that humans have come up with in at least the Mediterranean or Western world as I know it, and I admit the limitations of my global reach here, but still, this gives us lots of options, and it's to be understood decisions were made. So some of the views include porous death, which is the view of death that means that the dead and the living are not completely separated from one another, but the so-called boundary, what appears at one's deathbed to be a boundary, is actually porous. And spirits can travel back and forth between the world of the dead and the world of the living. And the most famous example is that of Hamlet's father. I think in the English speaking world that is true. And but it has a downside. Um, we living folks do not necessarily like to have our parents or our ancestors come back from the dead and tell us what to do, which traditions we should adhere to, and how we should behave. So, in reaction to that interference from beyond, people came up with another notion of death, which I call neutral death, in which the barrier is much stronger. So it's a reaction against porous death. And in neutral death, the dead are banished. They're not allowed back into the minds of the living, and tradition gets downplayed. And we living humans are free to live as we wish without the overweening superego of the traditions of our ancestors. Now, obviously, these archetypes can be exaggerated. They're never completely pure, and they interact. And that tension produces a lot of debate, a lot of literature, a lot of nightmares, a lot of dreams. And so there are no hard and fast lines between these. But then the trouble with neutral death is that wrongdoers of all types, from the worst tyrants to the worst miscreants of any sort, they die and they just go to the other world and we never hear any more about them. But we want to know what happened to the tyrants or the rapists or the war criminals. And so we need to know that something has happened, that the evil are punished and the good are rewarded. And that is moral death. And so judgment separates the righteous from the wicked, not just at death, a nice burial as opposed to a not nice burial, but in sources like Plato, in the Old Testament. Daniel has a very strong hint of this. And Matthew, well, the New Testament is very clear that there is moral death, but it's particularly strong in Matthew and in Revelation. But my point in this quick review is that adding judgment to the afterlife is a culturally selected option. And as I hope to show, at least through illusion, it can be politically enforced, but it can also be undone. And people can cease to believe in it and debate it and maybe reverse it and do a different blend of concepts of death. Then there's another. The third one is much tougher. It's one that I've put a lot of emphasis on. If you recall last week, I underlined the word inner as being a very important word in all my study of the afterlife. And the inner hell, that's a phrase that Joanne, my wife, brought up to me early in my investigation of hell. She said, well, there's this idea of the inner hell. And bing, that started off a whole range of reflection that has been extremely rich. So, what it turns out is that the contemplation of hell can be beneficial instead of just being morbid or sadistic or guilt ridden. It can cleanse the conscience. As you read about the various torments or the experiences of people who think they've been to hell or had near death experiences or have read literature that involves voyages to hell and then reflect on it, to the extent that it inspires introspection, it can be a morally cleansing procedure, and that's a very, very important benefit of thinking about the consequences, not just in the immediate future, but the long term, in fact, eternity. So neglect of this in the idea as it's stated in the literature I've studied, which is largely medieval, but not only, the neglect of this discipline leads to hell and invites its torments, because the ones you haven't considered are the ones that are the punishments for the sins you've probably committed. And so if you haven't reflected on them, you can't make amends, you can't have compunction, and so you go unconfessed, unrepentant into hell. That's the concept of inner death. Now, I want to show you the different stages of this belief, of the aspects of these different concepts of death. And they're not in chronological order because I've picked them for their clarity, not for their evolution. So here's an image from the monastery on Mount Athos, and it's called the Anastasis, which is the moment when Christ goes between his crucifixion and resurrection, and in the process of his own resurrection, he goes not to hell, as it's frequently said in English, he goes to Hades, or Sheol, the Hebrew term for the same world, and rescues Adam. And here you can see Adam and Eve and other ancient folks being resurrected by Christ, bearing his cross, and other saints witnessing and hoping. This is John the Baptist. I don't think all of them have been identified, but that doesn't matter. Here you see Satan. No, I'm sorry. You see Hades, the god of the underworld, and his gates crushed, shattered by the Christ in the process of being resurrected. So here is an underworld that is not punitive. These folks are waiting, they're unhappy, they anticipate salvation, but they are not being punished for their sins. They are merely dead. Here, now we're jumping conceptually. This is probably executed about the same time as the previous image, but this is in the West, in Germany. It's the Bamberg apocalypse. It was probably, well, anyway, it shows the Last Judgment with Christ holding the cross and angels using scrolls to display the text from Matthew 25. The one on the left, Venite Beati Patris Mei, come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And they are greeting the resurrected folks who are moving upward into heaven. And here is Discedite a me, maledicti, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. There could not be a sharper illustration of moral death. Here is the Last Judgment with heaven at the top and hell at the bottom. Here you see Satan with his spiky hair. We looked at the spiky hair Satan last week, and in chains, and a demon pulling other people of various ranks. This is a churchman, this is a king, there's a crown here, it's very hard to see, and then other folks who followed them. But here is a illustration that matches the one that's also the harrowing of hell, as it's called in English, the anastasis, which this time the land of the dead is punitive, because this, first of all, this is a psalter. This is the verse, who is the King of glory, the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle? Open up, ye gates, you princes. This is from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And here comes Christ to rescue the dead from the land of the dead, Sheol, Hades. But this time it looks like hell. So there's a cultural evolution that goes from the moral death that goes from the neutral death to the moral death. And these are folks who are being punished. They're not simply awaiting their redemption. So there's a huge cultural shift that goes on that I won't try to date right now, but in my writing, I do try to be very careful about the chronology of these different images and show how there's this tension. It's not as if there was one orthodoxy that was understood by everybody and changed suddenly. Here's another image from the same manuscript, again showing the division of the world. This again is a psalter, so it illustrates Psalms, but it shows very much a Christian view of the world, with the blessed up here on either side of Christ on his throne, And here are the damned in ovens being tended by demons, and they are roasting in the eternal fire. Now I want to shift slowly to the inner death, but we'll start with a very famous, extremely beautiful, remarkable image of the Last Judgment by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. Uh, and here you see Christ rendering judgment, and with his right hand he brings the blessed up, and with his left hand he sends the accursed down. And down here there's an image of hell. You can just see the flame in this picture, but it's not the flame I want to focus on here. I want to show you a detail of this figure on his way down. So it's important to see the context of where he is. Here he is again. These are the folks going down. And what is he doing? Now, I'm interpreting based on the literature I've read and what I've told you about these competing notions of death. This is inner death. This soul is reflecting on his life and what he's done that is going to cause his damnation, or has, in fact, caused his damnation. And here in the midst of the Last Judgment, at the end of time, he is contemplating eternity in hell. And it's this inner, this sense of the interiority, the psychological, the drama in the conscience that takes place that is so important in the tradition of hell, and that I found so rewarding in my study of it. The respect for the individual, in spite of the doctrinal blankets that tell people what to believe, there's room for this individual self-judgment that I found extremely rewarding to contemplate, and to the extent that I'm able to explain. And here again is a very famous image of, shall I say, exactly the same thing. Surely there are differences, but for our purposes this morning, here is the thinker, and here are the gates of hell by Rodin, done in 1902. That it was he got the commission to create this work in 1880, but it wasn't cast and actually made into a gate until 1902. So fairly modern. And we go from, so one of the things I've been stressing, and I want to underline here, is the continuity of these traditions. So we have these strands that are interwoven between the idea of the poorest death with ghosts, and with the ability of people to go to the other world and come back and tell what they've said. At the same time, the interior journey of individual sinners, individual penitents, individual thinkers who are reflecting on their own lives. This is a better view of the whole composition. And for those of you, since most of us are on the West Coast, I saw one of you is in Milwaukee. But for those of us on the West Coast, there's a copy of this work at Stanford University. So it's worth a trip all the way down from Oregon just to see this. Now, the tradition that I've discussed involves eternal damnation. And not everybody was satisfied with that concept. they thought that it was a contradiction from their understanding of divine mercy. We talked about the competition between the notions of justice and mercy, and the question of how we know whether God is just or not. So here is, in my opinion, the most important of the oppositions, the objections to eternal punishment. And this is from Origen of Alexandria, who died in 253, so very early, previous to, say, Augustine and Jerome and the very formative uh, fathers of the church. Uh, Origen was an amazing scholar. He did translations of the Bible into several languages. He was himself tortured for his original thinking. He died as a result of the torture, and a remarkable person. So his thought is that the fire of hell is not an external fire prepared for the devil and his angels, but it's an internal fire. And he draws on a line in Isaiah and interprets it to what I've got at the bottom of this slide. Each fire kindles the flame of sins proper to oneself. So this is a form of inner death, but it's construed in such a way that it limits the possibility of it precludes the possibility of eternal punishment because God's actions are all beneficial. So if he punishes, the punishment corrects. So Origen says divine power is constant goodness. And so the suffering of the, in quotation marks, one has to say, the suffering of the damned corrects the conscience. It makes the sinner aware of what they have done wrong, and so the soul returns to devotion. It's a progressive notion of punishment. In the debates that are going on in the country today, this would be called restorative justice. And I'll talk about that next week. But that's why I want to stress Origen. So please make a note of the importance of Origen. He is absolutely vital to the whole question of the justice of postmortem punishment. It should be said, I don't know if there's a later slide or not, but that the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century outlawed the teaching of Origen twice. In 543 and 553, I think are the dates. He knew as emperor that there had to be one person in command, not just of the empire, but of the cosmos, and that his decisions had to be final. So it was a model of a parallel. As God commands the world, so the emperor commands the empire. And strict monarchy of that sort demanded final decisions about the fate of every subject and every soul. So I want to propose a correlation between political organization and religious formation. So that's Origen. He's vital to this story. Another type of resistance to the idea of hell occurs in the vision of Paul. Now, this is a fictional account drawing on the passage in Paul where he says, I know a person who was rapt to the third heaven. What he saw, I cannot say. And then a manuscript, I mentioned this last week, a manuscript was found under Paul's house at Tarsus, and word of that text circulated around the Mediterranean world rapidly, and it was translated into every vernacular language. It is the single most widespread account of the other world outside of the Bible until Dante. So we're talking 388 to the 1320s. That's 1,000 years. So in the vision of Paul, I told you about the trial where the prosecuting devils denounce the souls as they appear before the throne of God at the moment of death. But then the text goes on to say Paul was taken to see the underworld, which exists at two levels. One contains a long catalog of punishments for every sin, and the punishments are indeed the sadistic kind of punishments that everybody associates with hell, and that I don't want to go into the details of it. It's very distracting and not really important. It's basically torture, and torture was widespread in the ancient world, as was slavery, and torture was a form of discipline used to maintain slavery in place. So that it was very easy to go from real world torture, which was legal. There were even specialists called torturers on big estates where the owner of many slaves would hire a torturer or promote one of the slaves to be the torturer. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. I wasn't going to do that. So the punishments exist in the.
Sorry, buddy.
That's okay. Sorry. The detailed sadistic torture-like punishments are at the first level, and they're bad. But then there's a wall at the bottom of this first level through which you pass to go to the lower level, where the tortures are even worse by a factor of 7. And believe me, if you've read this text, they're bad enough. So a factor of 7 is pretty rough. Paul goes down there with the angels who are guiding him, and he's so horrified by the torture that he calls out to God. And Christ comes with his court. So imagine the whole court of heaven comes down to hell, and moved by the pity, the sympathy, the empathy, the charity that Paul represents, Christ says, okay, for you, my friend, meaning Paul, I will give all these souls a day off. And then the literary tradition varies. Is it always Sunday, every Sunday, or is it only Easter Sunday? But at any rate, there's a whole tradition. So there's an interruption of the punishments that represents an objection to an eternal, unyielding, unchanging hell. And then there's resistance number 3, which is escape. And this I have to just touch on quickly because there are examples in the literature of people being able to pray souls out of hell. And so people who know that there is such a thing as Catholicism, which proposes purgatory, then you say, okay, these are the roots of purgatory. So if hell can be temporary, if it's possible for living souls to pray on behalf of damned souls and they can escape, then that's another objection to the eternity of hell. So purgatory, that's a whole separate chapter, a whole book. And as you know, endless debates came from it. And the Reformation, I don't have to tell this group, attacked the monetization of the prayers for those in purgatory. So again, we're talking huge cultural moments. So here's Justinian. I got the dates right. And Charlemagne did not specifically condemn Origen, but he did the theology that you can construct from reading his legislation creates a parallel. This again is the kind of correlation between earthly politics and the heavenly model, and the application of religious ideas to political, what shall we call it, ideology, political thought, political rhetoric that explains the world as the ruler imagines it to the subjects. So a word like faith, fides, becomes fidelity, and the fideles are his subjects. So anyone in the empire of Charlemagne is one of his fideles, but fideles is also the term that will become a vassal. So that as you are a faithful vassal of the king or the emperor or your lord, get it, Lord, small l, capital L, you can be faithful, a faithful follower or unfaithful. So in the Carolingian period and then the Ottonian period, and then for centuries, the correlation between an unfaithful subject and an unfaithful believer, a non-believer, became a political fact of life. And you could be disciplined, you could be expelled, you could be exiled, you could be tortured, killed, dispossessed of your property, banished, all of these things for being an unfaithful follower of your Lord with a small l / Lord with a capital L, in other words, for heresy, as well as for rebellion against the political Lord. I've shown you this illustration last week from the vision of Tundle. I want to allude to a different aspect of it. Last week I said that you see Satan also punished, but in the vision of Tundle, this knight who, in his repentance, imagines himself visiting hell, he goes across a very narrow bridge paved with spikes, and he's carrying a calf that he stole, which is why he's guilty. And he's walking across this bridge with his feet getting pierced. And beneath the bridge, in this chasm that he's crossing, is the fire of hell. And coming right away across the same bridge, and it's very narrow, is another person. There's no escape. The only thing he can do is fall into hell. And he says, I shouldn't have stolen this calf. And suddenly he's on the other side. This again is inner death. But that's elsewhere. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of Tundle carrying the cow. So let's look at Dante's Inferno. This is a big jump. This one means a lot to me. I've studied the Inferno. It was one of the great experiences of my life. I was laid up temporarily after a knee operation, nothing really serious, but serious enough. And I took 4 days off from work, and I decided I was going to read the Divine Comedy one volume at a time, one volume, one day. And I didn't make it. It took 4 days. But the sentence that really stuck is this one. Dante and Virgil are moving through a valley and it's dark. And what they see is a huge wave of what they think are fireflies. And Virgil says they're not fireflies, they're souls. And they each wrap themselves in that which makes them burn. So this is inner death again. The fire of hell is not the external. This is origin. The fire of hell is not the external fire. We're not in a volcano here, although volcanoes figured prominently in the imagery of hell. Where this is not a volcano. This is your conscience. Cartoon si fascia di quel che gli è inceso. They each wrap themselves in that which makes them burn. What a brilliant statement, and so rich in reflection and further thought, and historically vital when we talk about individual rights, when we talk about the self, when we talk about guilt. Here, Dante's got it in one sentence and one scene that I hope will stay with you because it's so powerful. Now, in Faust, I didn't get to Faust when we were talking about the devil yesterday, but or last week, but you know the story. And Faust is this professor who sells his soul to the devil for 2 reasons. He wants to have extensive, outstanding knowledge of science as he understood it, or as Goethe understood it. And we're talking late 18th century here. And he wanted to possess the beautiful young woman, Margaret or Gretchen. And so he sells his soul, and Mephistopheles, the representative of the devil, is guiding him through the rest of his life. He becomes his counselor, the evil angel on his shoulder, and they go on Walpurgisnacht, the festival between the end of winter and the beginning of spring, and they're up in it's a quasi pagan festival, although it's named after a saint, an 8th century saint in that region, but it's an old, much older festival. And in a valley, looking down in the middle of the festivities, it's a bacchanal. And in the middle of the festivities, he sees a woman that he thinks is Gretchen. And he says, I didn't realize she would be in hell. When I seduced her and had my pleasure with her, and we had a child which we killed, and I had a duel with her brother whom I killed. And when I did all that, I didn't realize she too would be damned. I gave you my soul willingly, but I didn't realize it would cost Gretchen her soul. And Mephistopheles says, you're not seeing that. That's not her. This is what happens on Walpurgisnacht. You're just making this up, Faust. You're just a little batty. And So there's this sentence. The German is just as clever, and this is one of the things I like about it. It's as Dante's Italian. It's a reflexive construction. To each comes his fate in the guise of his love. Denn jeden kommt sie wie sein Liebchen vor. So the point is that it's presented, Goethe gives it to us as the woman, your lady friend, is what you're going to imagine during the Bacchanal of Walpurgisnacht, because that's your life and you relate to her. But there's an allegorical level, which was no surprise to Goethe, that it's not just the woman that you lusted after, that you sold your soul in order to have. It's your fate. You're seeing your fate personified in the woman you loved, in what you love. It's the same, I contend, at least for points of comparison. If I taught comp lit, this would be an exam question. Is the Liebchen in this sentence the same as the fire that enshrouds the fireflies in Dante's Inferno? I think so. And this is a brilliant example of inner death. So here's the question of whether we need a hell if there's inner death, and if we could improve the moral situation of humankind by coming up with a rational framework of vices or sins or faults that would structure introspection so that we can experience contrition, we can make amends, we can return to a purer life having gone through that therapy. It might be that that's a good place to stop. I'm looking at the clock here. John, I don't know if you want to stop for questions, or I do have more slides, but let me know what you think.
It'd be your choice.
Excuse me?
I know a big help, but.
I think I'm just as happy stopping here. I mean, we can talk about the contemporary debates on hell. It's still lively in circles that are evangelical, circles that take every line of the Bible to be absolute truth. And then the question is, what do we do with the eternity of hell? And is it the Matthew 25, eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels? Is it the Gehenna to which is worse than cutting off your hand or blinding yourself rather than to think lustfully in Mark 9? So these passages are there. Revelation 20, the lake of fire and sulfur, that's eternal. What do we do with that passage? And then there are other passages. So there are different schools. Ecumenicalism tries to incorporate also passages which refer to the possibility of being forgiven in the other world. And universalism says, along the lines of Origen, that all will eventually be reconciled. Why would God punish if it doesn't do any good? Is the only good God getting even? I mean, Thomas Aquinas argued that because God is absolute and is eternal, that any offense against him must be be punished absolutely and eternally. So that works very well logically using the actual terms, but is that the God who became human to suffer as we do? Is that redemptive? What happens to redemption in that? Well, it's too late. You've died without repenting. So, okay. So that's the theology. And then there's another school called, I prefer annihilationism, but it's the term that's used more often is conditionalism, which is the notion that salvation is conditional, it depends on your devotion to God, and that if you do not devote yourself to God, then you disappear and you go into, you don't suffer consciously forever, you simply are gone. And that's annihilationism. You that you fall into an afterlife which consists of knowing that you are in the consciousness of no one, not God, not your family, no one. You exist, but you are nothing to anyone. And so uh, you're not physically punished, or you can, in fact, just disappear. And then there are the popularizing stories, the Left Behind series, which take hell very literally, and the version of the apocalypse, and the Left Behind series, which imagines the non-saved left on earth to be destroyed in apocalyptic terrors of fire and warfare and conquest and plague. And then there are video games, which take the fact that everyone knows what hell is, no matter what your belief of it is. And so there's a video game called The Dead War, in which the participant, the person with the computer, fights on his computer against the Nazis, who are all in hell, but they're seeking to come back to Earth, and so you get points for killing them off. Uh, so that's a popularization. Um, So Frankenstein, all right, we're talking about inner death. What is worse? Do we need a hell to suffer terribly? So Frankenstein, of course, is the doctor. He's not the monster that he made, the robot that he made. So in I'm getting out of order here. But anyway, the monster at the very end of Frankenstein, when he's left alone and Frankenstein has died, and the monster is still alive, and he says that when Satan fell from heaven, he at least had all the other demons who were with him in heaven, who were with him in hell. But I am alone because I am the only being of my sort, and I am alone in the world. And so this is a terrible fate, unlike that of any other existing thing. But of course, it's not hell because he will die, he will not last forever. It's not eternal, but it's a psychological state of Frankenstein's creation. And it echoes exactly what John Milton imagined for Adam in Paradise Lost. After the expulsion from paradise, Adam is bemoaning his fate, and he asks whether he should even exist. So Mary Shelley uses the same parallel. So Adam in Paradise Lost. Did I ask thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? And the monster says, at least Satan had the demons for company. I have no one. So questioning whether you ever should have existed is a hell on earth, a personal internal hell, which is, in my opinion, based on what I've read on this subject, the most important question of them all. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'll be happy to take questions.
Good. Oh, Alan, could you stop screen sharing? That way we'll see all the people, the gallery.
So, to close my slides
Yeah,
there. Okay.
I think you'll have to do end share at the top. It's probably at the top of your screen.
Yeah, I see share, but oh, okay, stop share, right? The red button.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
So, questions? Tom?
Yeah, Alan, Tom Dyke here. I have a question. The idea of neutral death seems to be pretty widespread in the ancient world, I think. But but in the medieval world, you get this vivid notion of death, all the moral death, all the torments and punishment. What factors in society caused that shift in viewpoint? I mean, was it social, or is there something going on within the church that drove that, or I'm just sort of wondering why that transition occurred.
It's easier for me to explain why moral death than it is to explain the continuation of neutral death. Neutral death is banishment. And in a way, hell is a form of banishment. And but the need for justice, I think it has to do with an empire. I think it's a consequence of the Roman Empire and the power of the emperor, or at a smaller level, the ability of a slave owner to command what happens to each individual under his power. And of course, but I don't feel very satisfied with my own answer. What still makes for neutral death? I think what they're doing is taking some of the advantages of neutral death and applying it to hell. So that heaven, you want to be able to talk to the saints, the saved, especially if they're your relatives, and you can ask them to intercede for you. Intercession is one of the great traditions in the Middle Ages, and it comes as a result of connection to a monastery or a convent. So that if you're well connected with an abbot or an abbess, they can have the nuns or monks pray on your behalf, and they invoke the saint that the institution is connected to intercede. And there are many stories of that happening. And on the other hand, you have the area which is just completely shut off and where the souls are banished and they suffer. I don't know, does that answer? Would you like to follow up?
Actually, it was a good answer. I guess what confuses me a little bit is why the issue, or why the concept of neutral death was so prevalent in the ancient world. I mean, things were pretty tough in that, in that world too. It's interesting that, well, and maybe I'm not right in thinking it was more prevalent than the idea of moral death.
I would just use a cliche, and that is the desire for individual freedom. And any and what we in 21st century America and those of us who lived in the 20th, adolescent restlessness with the influence of our parents. It's the desire to be your own person. And actually, I've never thought of this, but I think that that's part of what also leads to the inner death, the reflection of yourself and your relationship to the your own past, what you've done that's good and what you've done that's less good, and how you regret it. And so you don't need your parents and ancestors for that. You're just dealing with that on your own, like Faust imagining Gretchen in the festival. That's this is what I've done. This is who I am. I could have done better. I'm sorry about that. And so that's the individual in his own mind or her own mind. I don't know if that answers it. These are really basic human emotions. And I have no authority for telling you what is a universal human emotion. I only know what occurs frequently in the literature that I've read.
Maybe time for one more question. James?
Yeah, Mark Twain said that you go to heaven for the fine climate and hell for the good company. Anyways, these lectures have been very good. They've been excellent. And I've sort of come to the conclusion, maybe it's obvious to everybody, but any major religion out there, if they're going to be successful in long term, need a very robust hell. And, you have the 10 Commandments, and if you don't follow them, this is going to happen. You have the 7 pillars of Islam, and this is going to happen. So I think of today, in today's religion, especially here in America, the popular religions seem to be growing. The evangelicals, Southern Baptists, all that kind of crowd. So I don't know if it's just a aha conclusion on my part, but I think of the more mainstream moderate religions and they're really struggling. So maybe you should become very extreme. Crank up the membership. Just a thought. What do you think of that?
Well, the deterrent effect of hell is one of the chief arguments in favor of it. And if we need that discipline, please come back next week. I have, in quotation marks, I have an answer to that, to the deterrent effect. I will try to argue that we can see the benefits in our own society. And that if we treat others as we wish to be treated, and if others treat us as they perceive that we have treated them, we will get certain benefits or disadvantages depending on those perceptions. And so the more people help others, the more people help others, and we should be an example of helpers. And that hurt people. So we should hurt as few people as possible. But we also have to take their perceptions of hurt and help into account. And I'll talk about that next week when we look at prisons and the legal system. But I think that's a mechanism or that's a framework that is independent of an afterlife, which was a puzzle that I proposed for myself, not because there's no afterlife. I'm in no position to make that statement, but because there are so many afterlives in the different religions and the qualifications for getting there. And that has caused bloodshed for centuries. So I think we should try to do better. That's the puzzle I posed for myself. So I'll talk about that next week. But the idea of hell as a deterrent, that's crucial. It could be beneficial. I don't know how many people have stepped back from doing something wrong because they thought they would be damning themselves. I don't know. But they may have done it because, oh, I might get cancer. I might have a child I don't want to have. I might gain too much weight. This is bad for cholesterol. All these reasons. I shouldn't speed because my reactions aren't as good as they used to be. All of these are deterrents. And hell is another. We can use deterrents.
So, well, with that, I don't know if that's a happy place to stop. Thank you very much. So, good.
Okay. Thank you, John.
And again, I'll give you a call. So.
Okay, right.